All right, let's thank him for clarity again. In this chapter that I want to call Our Father, but maybe subtitle it Abide. And I'm not really happy with those two titles, but on default status, worst comes to worst, let's just go with titles that come straight out of the chapter. And Our Father is a quote that is literally going to come out of this chapter that seems to identify an identity crisis in Jesus's opposition. And if they would abide in the things that he is teaching them, as we talked about before, one of his roles identified by Isaiah is as the wonderful counselor. If they would walk in his counsel, then they would have additional clarity, thus thanking God for the potential clarity that he can give us if we'll just listen. In this chapter that starts out in the first 11 verses with a relatively famous story of the woman caught in the act of adultery. And organizationally, we might be able to look at it from the woman, the light in the next section, the truth in the section after that, and I guess the dispute that is going to end the chapter. But first, the woman caught in the act of adultery. Without going through the story again, thematically, the thing that stood out to me was the fact that the crowd, once again, has a great division in it. Maybe not numerically, but is going to say in the first couple of verses that Jesus went away to the Mount of Olives, went away to the Mount of Olives, but early in the morning he came back to the temple to teach, as in verse 2, all the people came to him. However, mixed in with the people were those who came and presented to him the woman caught in the act of adultery. And the division is between those who were actually there to genuinely learn and those who were there just to start trouble and drama, whatever you want to call it. I'm having trouble with my vocabulary, but they just weren't there to genuinely learn. It's literally going to say to test them that they might have something or a charge to bring against him. But the danger in that is the word literally says we can't serve two masters. And so in persistently falling into a pattern where, as we say from time to time, they're trying to poke holes in what he's saying or find fault, they are becoming unproductive in things that actually matter, as we're going to see in the next section, where he is going to say he is the light of the world. But they are going to miss out on that light because they are going to so resent the fact that he would basically get out of his lane, not the lane that the Father has designated for him, but the lane that they have designated for him, saying that he seems like he's pretty proud when he's calling himself the light of the world, but what he's actually shining a light on is their pride. Why? Because as Nicodemus saw in the previous chapter, if they would simply take the time to look at all of the available facts, they might have a different perspective on who he is and what he is saying. However, not only going back to the previous chapter where Nicodemus tried to get them to look at a broader view of the issue, going forward in the next chapter where Jesus is going to heal the man born blind from birth, they are going to declare themselves as those in Israel who see. And he's going to say, because you've declared yourselves as those who see, having all the information you need, that is where your guilt is going to remain. And so what happens is it's the reverse of what we've talked about before, the need to reframe the issue when we are too narrowly focused on our problems. Here, God is trying to get them to reframe the issue around the things that Christ is literally telling them, the truth that he gave the Christ to tell them. But they are fixating on the way that the truth he is telling them doesn't fit with what they have already chosen to believe. But going toward the end of that section, like we said, verses 12 going on through around verse 30, that conflict is actually going to produce blessings, because even though they are choosing to fixate on a narrow set of reality that seems to affirm what they already believe, others are going to legitimately believe that reality is a little bit larger than what they are choosing to fixate on. And verse 30 is going to say, as he was saying these things, many believed in him. But as we have said before, verses 31 through 38 are going to go on to talk about the truth, because he's going to make it clear to them that it is not just enough that they believe, but as we mentioned before, they need to abide in his words, essentially the counsel that he is offering them, because there are some very important things that need to be done if they are going to make good or make the knowledge that he is the Christ, if they're going to make it matter. And so he is telling them that beyond believing, they need to abide in his words, because that will open the door for them to understand the truth that will actually free them, causing them to question, why do we need to be freed? We're sons of Abraham. We've never been slaves to anybody, which is ironic because the Romans are ruling them right now. And so it seems as we mentioned, they may have something of an identity crisis. They might feel free, but it's only because they've adjusted to the reality of their confinement or the authority that's ruling over them in the way of the Romans. That's not the way God had designed it for them. And so they have settled into feeling free, even though they're living beneath their potential. But that's not going to be the only problem, because in addition to potentially having an identity crisis related to their freedom versus their actual enslavement to the Romans, they're going to have an identity crisis as to who their fathers actually are, not their biological fathers, but their forefathers, understanding that they believe that Abraham is our father, beginning in verses 39, really almost going to the end of the chapter, really more clearly as the ESV has it lined up in verse 47. That section will conclude. But they're going to think that their father is Abraham, but he's going to say, no, Abraham's not your father because he had a certain behavior pattern that you were not following in. You were not doing the works that Abraham did. You got to keep searching. You got another father. You keep looking. They're going to be like, no, well, God's our father. They're going to say that in verse 41. And he's going to say, nope, wrong again. God's not your father, because if you skip down to verse 47, they would recognize that the things he was saying and really doing were actually from God. Verse 47 reading, whoever is of God hears the words of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God. One of the reasons we'll be able to see that is in the things that they are actually doing. He's going to break the bad news to them. The things that they are doing are actually of the devil for two reasons. One, because they are steeped in dishonesty. Their denial is going beyond what we said before, mere skepticism, to a willing denial to exclude everything that does not agree with what they already believe. How do we know? Am I making it up? No. He's going to say in verse 44, you are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desire. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he has nothing to do with the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character. And so it's the dishonesty along with the murder. But wait a minute, they're still in denial about whether or not they are trying to kill him. However, there are, as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, earlier manifestations of murder long before the act actually takes place. And sometimes there are low-key forms of aggression that are basically the only socially acceptable version of what someone really wants to carry out in certain manifestations of anger. Understanding that, we're going to get to maybe see a red flag for it in the way that they are responding to the truth that he is teaching them. Indulging something, as we mentioned recently, I think the sermon on Sunday, something that looks an awful lot like what we would describe today as ad hominem attacks, attacking the person, not the logic of what they are actually saying. The first indication we might see is an illustration we used on Sunday in verse 41, when he says, you are doing the works that your father did. He hadn't called him the devil yet, but in response, they're going to say to him, we were not born of sexual immorality. What does that have to do with what he just said? Well, it doesn't have much to do with it, other than it's a personal attack on him that prevents them from having to deal with the logic of what he is saying. But they're going to double down on that after he actually basically tells them their father is the devil, because the approach that they're taking is not only dishonest, but it's hostile, and the full manifestation of the hostility will be seen later. But in verse 48, they're going to seem to escalate the personal attack when they say, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? He's going to, of course, deny the fact that he has or deny the allegation that he has a demon, and they are going to once again, in verse 52, repeat it again. Now we know that you have a demon, after he responds in verse 50. He does not seek his own glory, but if anyone keeps his word, they will never see death. Provoking them to conclude the chapter by not only saying, now that's full confirmation, I guess, that he has a demon, but they're going to say, Abraham and the prophets are dead. Yet you're saying if anybody keeps your word or abides in your word, they'll never see death. Confirmation that they've seen all they need to see. But he is going to say, you don't necessarily understand, because Abraham actually did see his day and he rejoiced, marking another distinction between Abraham and you. Even though you're claiming that Abraham's your father, Abraham was glad when he got to see the day of the Christ, whether they understand it or not. But the thing that is clear is their response to seeing the Christ is very different. They are resenting everything that he is trying to tell them, while he is saying, if Abraham was really your father and God was really your father, you'd be rejoicing at the things that the people around them are actually able to appreciate, because they are not fixated on what they believe they already understand about Israel and the Christ. Understanding that, it reminds me of the thing I think caught my attention most about this chapter. And it's what we said we would try to circle back to. That is the way that it's not simply a battle of ideas, but when Jesus is saying you have to abide in his word, because there are some things that abiding in his word will actually produce in your life. In some ways, as we mentioned from time to time, he's pointing forward to his illustration in chapter 15, that he is the vine and we are the branches, and the measurement that his father uses to determine who gets to remain basically in the family and legitimately called not only Abraham, but God their father, is whether or not they're being productive. And the tragedy of this situation is what he is literally going to say in that portion of verses 21 through roughly 30 that I skipped over, where he is literally telling them they are going to die in their own sins. At which point I'm going to ad-lib and basically combine some things we have seen previously in the Gospels that are basically going to say you can't serve two masters. To the degree that they are fixated on finding fault in the Christ, they are over time losing their ability to be productive in the things that God is calling them to do. Can't serve two masters. You can't nitpick someone else's lane and be effective in fully running and reaching your potential in yours. And that's the tragedy of what's going on here. It is not simply a battle of ideas. It is the fact that they are fixating on a set of ideas that are rendering them unproductive in a way that may eventually lead to God removing them from the family altogether. Understanding that this chapter quite possibly gives us yet another perspective on the distinction between personality and character. As we often say, what we project versus what we actually are. We've studied that before, but the nuance here is the identity crisis. Because over time, if I get in the habit of projecting a much more distinct or distinctly different personality than what my character actually is, then the danger is not only that other people might believe it, but over time, I might believe it. Therefore, the Pharisees and the assorted opposition to Christ, they really seem to believe that Abraham is their father. They really seem to believe that God is their father. But the problem seems to be, as we mentioned before, that over time, neither their deeds nor their beliefs are any longer in line with the things that God has actually, literally called his people to be. Which is why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, to the degree you still have mercy and patience with us, please guide us into having hearts that are genuinely seeking to have you realign our focus into things that are genuinely productive and consistent with what you've called us to be.